Do you live in Sicily, or do you have family in Catania, Giare, Zafferana Etnea, Linguaglossa, or any of the towns that circle the base of Mount Etna? If the answer is yes, you need to watch this entire video, because Europe's tallest and most active volcano has spent the past 2 weeks doing something serious enough that international aviation authorities pushed the alert for this mountain to the highest level that exists, and the danger has not fully passed. Mount Etna rises roughly 10,900 feet above the eastern coast of Sicily, and it has been in a documented state of near continuous activity since late June of 2026. On the morning of July 5th, at around 7:45 local time, the mountain began strong ash emissions and strombolian activity from a vent on the upper eastern flank of the Voragine summit crater. Within hours, an ash plume was rising well over a kilometer above the summit itself, and prevailing winds pushed that plume directly south, straight over the flight paths into Catania Fontanarossa, Sicily's busiest airport. Aviation authorities responded by issuing a red-level volcano observatory notice for aviation, the highest ash warning that exists for pilots anywhere in the world, a signal reserved for eruptions producing ash concentrations dense enough to seriously threaten jet engines. Here's why this is serious. Catania Fontanarossa is not some small regional airstrip. It is the primary gateway for a metropolitan region of well over 300,000 people in the city alone. And during the height of the eruption, the airport was forced into a complete shutdown of all flight operations. That closure did not last a single afternoon. It stretched into a third consecutive day, paralyzing air travel to and from Sicily during the peak of the European summer travel season, stranding thousands of passengers and forcing airlines to cancel and reroute flights with almost no notice. Under EU passenger rights rules, volcanic eruptions are classified as extraordinary circumstances, meaning airlines are not required to pay the usual cash compensation for these disruptions, which left many travelers covering their own rebooking and accommodation costs during the chaos. This next part matters, because it shows this was not an isolated flare-up. The current episode traces back to June 26th, when a new fissure first opened at the eastern base of the Voragine crater, at an elevation of roughly 3,030 meters, prompting Italy's civil protection authorities to raise the ground level alert from green to yellow. From that vent, lava began flowing slowly downhill into the upper Valle del Leone, part of the larger Valle del Bove depression that flows away from the summit on the volcano's eastern side. By late June and into early July, strombolian explosions, the kind that throw glowing fragments of molten rock rhythmically into the air, were intensifying at the Voragine crater, and volcanologist Boris Benka of the Catania Observatory publicly described the explosive and effusive activity there as clearly increasing over just a matter of days. But here is the problem. The mountain did not stop at one vent. On July 5th, the day the Red Aviation Alert was issued, an entirely separate fissure tore open, this one extending from the Voragine crater northeast toward the northeast crater. Along the higher sections of that new fissure, vents continuously pumped out ash, while lower vents produced sustained strombolian explosions of their own. That means, for several days running, Etna had two independent eruptive fronts working at once, one slowly effusing lava toward the Valle del Bove, and a second violently fountaining ash and rock along a fresh crack in the summit. Ash from that second fissure climbed to an estimated 4.5 kilometers above sea level, and it drifted south-southeast, dropping ash on towns between the mountain refuge of Refugio Sapienza, only about 5 kilometers from the vents, and Catania itself, roughly 29 kilometers away. And now it gets worse, in terms of what the historical record says this mountain is capable of when conditions align differently than they have this month. Etna is considered the second most continuously active volcano on Earth, after Kilauea in Hawaii, with documented eruptive activity stretching back to roughly 1500 BCE, one of the longest continuous volcanic records in human history. Since the year 1900 alone, Etna has shown eruptive activity in 122 out of the past 127 years, meaning this mountain spends the overwhelming majority of its existence in some active state, whether that means quiet daygassing, minor strombolian bursts, or the kind of dual vent explosive activity seen this month. Historians of volcanism consider the largest eruption in Etna's recorded history to have occurred in 122 BC, an explosive Plinian eruption large enough to register at the highest end of the volcanic explosivity index used for events of this type, an eruption category associated with catastrophic regional scale destruction whenever it occurs at any volcano on the planet. This is where it becomes dangerous to assume the modern era is somehow immune to that kind of history repeating. Go back to November of 1928. Fissures opened on Etna's eastern and northeastern flanks, and lava began racing downhill far faster than anyone expected. Within roughly 2 to 3 days, a wall of molten rock reached the town of Mascali, home to close to 10,000 people at the time, and it did not stop until nearly the entire town was buried. Somewhere between 4,300 and 5,000 residents were left homeless almost overnight, and the lava field ultimately covered more than 4 million square meters of ground. Authorities managed to evacuate the population in time to prevent mass casualties, but the town itself was gone, and it had to be completely rebuilt on the coastal plain below. To this day, volcanologists treat 1928 as the benchmark event for what Etna can do when a flank fissure opens closer to inhabited land rather than in the empty upper reaches of the mountain. And 1928 was not even the worst case in Etna's history. In 1669, a far larger eruption sent a lava flow roughly 17 kilometers long directly into the city of Catania, destroying close to half the city in the process, the single most destructive eruption this volcano has ever produced. And the reason modern hazard planners in Sicily still study fissure locations with such intensity every time new activity appears, because Catania sits in almost exactly the same geographic exposure today that it did more than 350 years ago, except now it holds an international airport, a major seaport, and well over 1 million people across the wider metropolitan area. Most people watching casual coverage of this eruption are missing this next detail entirely. Etna is one of the most heavily monitored volcanoes on Earth, watched by more than 50 seismometers, a dense GPS network tracking ground deformation in real time, thermal and visible light cameras running continuously, and satellite instruments scanning for heat anomalies and ash from orbit. That density of monitoring exists precisely because Italy's National Institute of Geophysics and Volcanology knows this mountain does not always provide a long, clean warning before conditions shift dramatically. Instruments on the summit picked up subtle but genuine signs of internal pressure building during this exact episode, including a measurable tilt shift at one monitoring station and nanostrain level decompression signals at another, the kind of small but real ground movement that, alongside a newly opened fissure and days of sustained volcanic tremor, tells scientists the system is far from finished processing, whatever pressure drove this eruption in the first place. One more thing you need to know is that this is not the first time in recent memory that Etna has forced Catania's airport to shut its doors. Major eruptions in 2023, 2024, and 2025 all caused airport closures of their own, a pattern serious enough that regional aviation and travel industry sources now treat volcanic disruption at Catania as an expected, recurring hazard of living and traveling in this part of Sicily, rather than a rare anomaly. In July of last year, a similar eruption from the same general area of the summit sent lava cascading down the mountain and forced another temporary shutdown of the airport, almost exactly 1 year before this month's escalation. That kind of recurring pattern matters, because it means the infrastructure risk here is not a single freak event. It is a structural reality of building one of Europe's busiest regional airports directly downwind of one of the most active volcanoes on the planet. Now the focus shifts to what the mountain has actually done since the peak of the crisis. Activity along the new fissure between the Voragine and northeast craters began decreasing on the afternoon of July 6th and had largely quieted by early afternoon on July 7th. But by the following weekly monitoring report, ash plumes were still rising to nearly 4 kilometers above sea level and drifting east, even as ground deformation networks reported only minor changes rather than a dramatic new swelling of the mountain. That is the language of a volcano pausing, not a volcano that has concluded its business. Etna has done exactly this before during this very eruptive sequence, quieting for hours or days before another vent reactivates, another fissure opens, or Strombolian explosions intensify again without meaningful warning. As of the most recent observatory updates, the effusive vent at the Voragine has continued releasing lava toward the east, with the leading edge of the flow sitting at an elevation around 2,700 to 2,750 meters. While volcanic tremor amplitude has held at moderate levels over recent monitoring windows, a sign that the underlying system feeding this eruption remains energized even during the quieter phases. But that is not the real story tonight. The real story is that Italy's Civil Protection Department, even at the height of a Red Aviation Alert and 2 simultaneously active vents, kept the ground level hazard alert at yellow, the second lowest of 4 tiers, because the immediate danger has remained concentrated at the summit and in the airspace above it, rather than threatening towns lower on the slopes. That gap between a red alert in the sky and a yellow alert on the ground is exactly the kind of detail that can lull people into a false sense of calm. Ash falling on rooftops and windshields in towns between Rifugio Sapienza and Catania is a disruption. An international airport shutting down for 3 straight days during peak summer travel is a major disruption. But a volcano sitting directly above a metropolitan region of well over 1 million people, actively producing lava from one vent while explosively fountaining from a second, brand new fissure only a short distance away, is the kind of situation that professional monitoring teams do not stop watching for a single hour, regardless of what color sits on the ground level scale that day. Picture what this actually looks like for the people who live under that mountain right now. families across towns like Zafferana, Etnea, Nicolosi, and Linguaglossa go to sleep with the summit glowing red in the distance, visible for kilometers after dark during the most active nights of this eruption. Some mornings, farmers on Etna's fertile eastern and southern slopes step outside to find a fine layer of gray ash settled across vineyards and orchards that have grown in volcanic soil for generations, ash that can damage crops and machinery even when lava itself never threatens the land directly. Guides who normally lead tourists up toward the summit have had to suspend the highest elevation tours during the most intense explosive phases, restricting public access to roughly 2,900 meters and below, even as lower altitude cable car and off-road vehicle tours have continued for visitors, willing to view the eruption from a safe distance. None of this is happening in some remote, empty wilderness far from civilization. It is happening directly above and around one of Sicily's most populated and economically vital regions, during the exact weeks when hundreds of thousands of tourists are visiting the island for its beaches, its history, and yes, often specifically, to see this very volcano up close. This is where the science becomes simple enough for anyone to understand, even without ever opening a volcanology textbook. When magma rises beneath a volcano like Etna, it does not always take the shortest path straight up through the main summit craters. When enough pressure builds beneath the surface, it can instead force its way sideways, cracking open a fissure somewhere along the mountain's flank, sometimes at high elevation near the summit craters, the way it has behaved for most of this particular eruptive episode, and sometimes much lower down, closer to towns and farmland. Exactly the way it happened catastrophically in 1928, and again, on a far larger scale, in 1669. The tilt measurements, the strain measurements, and the tremor levels being tracked around the clock by Italian monitoring teams exist specifically to catch the earliest signs that magma is shifting toward a new pathway, because the difference between a fissure opening at 3,000 meters in an empty, inaccessible section of the Valle del Bove and a fissure opening a few hundred meters lower, closer to inhabited land, can be the difference between a spectacular but largely contained natural event and a genuine humanitarian emergency requiring mass evacuation. Here's why none of this should be dismissed as routine tourist volcano footage that Sicily simply lives with every summer. The aviation color code was specifically raised to red because the volume and height of ash emission crossed a threshold that international aviation safety protocols treat as a serious hazard to jet engines and airframes, an alert level Etna has reached only a handful of times in recent years. Notably, this is not even the only time this year the mountain has forced that response. Earlier in 2026, a separate eruptive episode intensified enough to disrupt flights at Catania for nearly a week on its own. The fact that Etna has now reached that same red threshold twice within a single year, through two distinct eruptive episodes, tells scientists that the volcano's broader multi-year eruptive phase, which some observers trace back to activity beginning around 2022, remains highly energetic and capable of producing serious aviation and ground hazards on a timescale of months rather than years. What happened next, in terms of the broader pattern across this entire eruptive sequence, is that Etna has essentially refused to settle into any single predictable rhythm. It cycled through gas and ash emissions in the spring of this year, a new effusive vent opening in late June, a fresh explosive fissure opening in early July that pushed the aviation color code to its highest level for the second time in 2026, a partial pause by mid-month, and monitoring networks that continue to detect subtle ground deformation, suggesting magma has not finished moving beneath the surface, even during these quieter stretches. Volcanologists who study Etna for a living describe this stop and start pattern as broadly consistent with the mountain's long-term behavior, but they are careful never to promise that the next phase will necessarily be smaller than the last. Weak eruptive pulses have preceded major paroxysms before on this exact volcano, and strong pulses have occasionally faded out with no further escalation at all. The uncertainty itself is precisely why the monitoring never stops, and why aviation authorities, tour operators, and Sicily's Civil Protection Department all continue adjusting their posture in near real time as new data comes in. The next several days on Etna could look like a continuation of the current pause, with degassing and minor ash emissions slowly tapering off the way earlier phases of this same eruption have done before. Or they could look like the beginning of another explosive episode entirely, another fissure, another ash column forcing flight disruptions over one of the busiest air corridors in the Mediterranean during the height of summer travel season. Italy's monitoring stations are recording data on this exact system as this video is being made, and the people of Catania, Nicolosi, Zafferana, Etnea, Linguaglossa, and every other town ringing this mountain are living underneath that uncertainty every single night, watching a glow on the horizon that has become both a familiar part of life on this island and, this month, a serious enough hazard to ground flights and put international aviation authorities on their highest possible alert. The system is still evolving. The atmosphere over eastern Sicily is still carrying traces of volcanic ash from an eruption that has already shut down a major international airport for 3 consecutive days, sent lava fountains hundreds of meters into the summer sky from 2 separate vents within days of each other, and forced the highest possible aviation alert level not once, but twice this year. The scientists who study this mountain most closely will tell you plainly that they do not yet know how the next chapter of this particular eruptive episode ends, and with a history that includes the destruction of an entire town in under 3 days back in 1928, and the loss of half a major city 3.5 centuries ago, this is a situation Sicily is taking seriously, and it is far from over tonight.